without any further ado, I might pass the baton over to Jacqueline Routh, who's the farmer board member for DairyNZ, to sort of actually, why are we doing this, Jacqueline?
Thank you very much, Simon. And yes, it's a question we're asked quite a lot. Why can't we just continue as we have been doing in the past? And so that's what today is about. It is discussing the options, and it is real consultation. We are adapting, adopting, discussing, modifying, making changes as we go along because of the feedback that we're receiving. So before we go through to the options in detail, I'll be covering a bit of the background to explain how we got here. This is a partnership. You see two of us here now, but we've been working with others as well. And the aim is to develop and provide better outcomes for farmers than the ETS. That's the emissions trading scheme, where it is a government-controlled system. We're very supportive of the options that have been developed through Waka Eke Noa, and it gives farmers and the industry more influence and control than the New Zealand ETS will allow. It also allows any revenue raised to be directed back into the agricultural sector. And this is just part of what we're doing. You'll see the red circle, but look at what else we're doing. It's a lot of work, all focused at climate change programs, and the sector bodies are all involved. So this includes telling the story around our carbon efficiency, and it also includes the advocacy, making it clear in Wellington and to society in general that we are amongst the most efficient producers of meat and milk in the world. It also includes working with the Climate Change Commission about reviewing our targets. And this is something that is in law now. So we can review the methane targets in 2024. The Climate Change Commission will be doing its next budgets then. For the sheep and beef sector, there's been another priority, and that's getting limits on forestry offsetting in the ETS. It also includes advocating for the latest science around the warming impact of short-lived gases. And that's a national discussion, but it's particularly the levy bodies having it with Wellington. But today we're focusing on that red circle around the policy implementation. We're thinking about the opportunity to develop an alternative pricing system to the New Zealand ETS. And this opportunity was given to us back in 2019 by the government in the form of creating Waka Eke Noa. We're all in this together. It's the Primary Sector Action Partnership. So the history, government's been wanting to price agricultural emissions since 2003. We managed not to get involved then. They tried again in 2008, and again we were able not to get involved. But in 2019, the government established the Climate Change Response Amendment Act, known in short as the Zero Carbon Act. We actually established it, we did get the principle of the split gas approach into the legislation, which separates the target for biogenic methane, that which comes out of our ruminants, from the long-lived gases. That was a big win. In fact, it was a huge win. And the next part was that the Zero Carbon Act, the government consulted on pricing, at that point, there were actually 16,000 responses in the consultation process. 93% of them said that all gases should go to zero. 7% of them were with agriculture, and we were then able to advocate hard, and some groups lobbied, to ensure that there was a split gas approach. That was another huge win. It was formally accepted in late 2019. And they also gave us the opportunity, as part of the big deal, to work out a system on our own with Waka Eke Noa, the Primary Sector Climate Action Partnership, that would allow us to do a whole heap of things to encourage farmers to make a change. So Waka Eke Noa, and Becky's going to change the slide. Thank you. It's a partnership. It's the government, the industry and the iwi all working together to address the agricultural emissions. You'll see all the levy bodies there on the right-hand side as you look at the screen. You'll see various industry groups. You'll see the Federation of Maori Authorities, and you'll also see Ministry for Primary Industries and Ministry for the Environment. This is a partnership. And in the way of all partnerships, not everybody gets exactly what they want, but by working together, the achievements are greater than anything we could achieve on our own. What we are intending is that this alternative framework will reduce emissions. That has to be a given. It will build resilience within our sectors, and it will mean that in 2025, there will be a price on our emissions. But the most important thing, mentioned by all our leaders, is that will allow us to maintain control and influence of our future, something that the emissions trading scheme does not. Thank you, Becky. We need to remember always that agricultural emissions are already in the New Zealand ETS legislation. So if we don't consider this He Waka Eke Noa as progress, then we're back in the ETS. That will be discussed. It can be turned on by the government at any stage. We don't have to wait till 2025. This is our opportunity to design a better alternative. It's not just, however, the government pushing us to do this. Yes, it's a legislated backstop, the ETS. We don't advocate going there. Yes, there are the Zero Carbon Act targets, but it's more than that. It's also the customer expectations. It's the fact that more and more of our trading partners are saying they want some reduction, they want to see us taking action. And it's also our community. We've seen everything that goes on in terms of whether agriculture is getting away with stuff or not. We must deliver a credible alternative. Otherwise, agriculture will be in the ETS. It's in legislation. So the community, our customers, and the government, but mostly we as farmers, and I am one, want to do the right thing. And we can show leadership in this space.
So yeah, just before we kind of get into the detail of the options, I'm just going to take you briefly through the criteria that we used to develop the options. So next slide, please, Rebecca. Thank you. So there are about 100 options that the partnership looked at. In order to assess them, they developed, as a partnership, we developed a number of criteria to assess them by, to help us kind of use drafting gates, for want of a better word. So the key ones here for us to develop a really, enduring and equitable system was that the options that we came up with were effective and that they reduce agricultural emissions. They're practical and that they were clear and simple systems for farmers to use. Credible in terms of they use the most scientifically robust science, and we'll get into some of those areas, like in the approach that we've taken on sequestration. Something, we have to be able to kind of demonstrate that what we're sort of doing is scientifically credible and stacks up globally. We've tried to take an integrated approach, and that we're looking at how those options align with, farm planning and how they align with freshwater policies. And then most importantly, the really important criteria for looking at those options was the equitable. Are they equitable? Do they work fairly across different farming systems, different stages of farming, early and young, early adopters? That was a really key criteria as well. So now, just having gone through that, I'll pass over to Roger to go into the ETS backstop.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ro. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger Lincoln. I work for DairyNZ, and I appreciate your time. I know you might want to be doing something else between the hours of 7 and 9 tonight, but this is quite an important issue for farmers, and so it's really, really important that we grab your feedback before we, put the recommendations through the government. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the backstop, which you've heard, and that is agriculture into the ETS. So next slide, please, Becky. So remember that this provision already exists in legislation, so it's not turned on though. So all that the government needs to do is do an order in council, and then bang, agriculture is into the ETS at the processor level, and sooner than 2025. So that's why it's really, really important to be talking about those credible alternative pricing mechanisms. But you know, what is the NZ ETS, and what does that mean? As has already been outlined, it's a government-controlled or regulated market approach, and it uses principally price to drive emissions down. So it's a cap and trade system. It hasn't always been capped. It was capped in 2019. And the key thing here is the ETS is now linked to the carbon budgets, which is linked to long-term targets. So everything is in alignment now. So the unit supply settings you see within the ETS all relate to net zero, right? To that long-term destination by 2050. So there's a cap that's set by those emissions budgets, and the Climate Change Commission provides the advice to the government on that. And then the price within the ETS is set by demand. So it's an auction system, and then units are entered in, and people purchase them. It includes all sectors of New Zealand except for agriculture. But of course, we know that when you fill up the tractor, when you fill up the ute, there's a carbon charge on that, and for your energy, that's already in there. But what we're talking about there is the biological emissions. They aren't priced within the ETS. So emitters would pay 1 NZU per tonne of CO2 equivalent emitted, and then foresters or sequesters receive 1 NZU per tonne of CO2 equivalent sequestered. So that's how the NZ ETS works. Next slide, thanks. So let's just imagine that that farmers are in this backstop option, and you see farmers on the left there. So let's just work through this. So your on-farm emissions will be calculated based on the national greenhouse gas inventory. So it would be an average across all farmers, and then you supply your product, or the processor purchases your product, so it goes to the processor, and then the processor actually reports those on-farm emissions and then purchases the New Zealand units within the ETS auction system. So it's the processor looking for those units to cover the emissions produced in respect of agriculture. And then of course, the processor doesn't just take the product and pay the bill. The processor reduces the payout back to farmers. So that's a reduced payout or increased fertilizer cost. In the system, remember that farmers could also use the ETS in terms of forestry, but it's not the additional vegetation that we're talking about in the other options. So there's still the ability for farmers to use the NZ ETS for forestry. On the right-hand side, the government, there's a little bit of discussion at the moment, and we've had ongoing discussion with government about what would they use the money that they collect for. So you'll know that within the emissions reduction plan, the government has signalled that it intends to use that money or reinvest it. So there's no government decision on that yet, but the government has signalled to us that they intend to use some of the revenue that's raised to go back into particular sectors. The key thing here is that the NZ ETS market, it determines the price of the emissions. So let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Becky. So what about the impacts and the cost in terms of the ETS backstop? So as I said before, the price is dictated by the ETS demand and the cap and trade and auction system. And we've got a pretty good idea in terms of future prices, because the Commission has done a whole lot of modelling in respect of those carbon budgets. So you see on the left-hand side from 2025, 2030, 2050, that carbon price increasing from $85 to $138 to $250. It just so happens yesterday I checked what the carbon price was, so on the NZU spot market, and it was $77. And I just checked before to see what it was, and it's now $81.50. So we've just turned 2022, and we're at $81.50, and all the projections are for the carbon price to be $85 by 2025. So that carbon price is actually moving through at a rate of knots. And if you look across in terms of that table, the impact of that cost in terms of milk solids or red meat. In 2025, it's 5 cents per kg of milk solids. For red meat, it's between 7 and 15 cents per kg, depending on whether it's lamb, beef, or venison. And then for fertilizer, it's 2 cents per kg of N. Someone asked me the other day, why are there different prices for the different sectors? That's the same price. The different prices are to do with the biological efficiency of the animals that we're talking about. And then of course you've got the 2030 numbers there as well. So scarcity of units in the ETS drives that price higher. Next slide, thanks, Becky. So this is why you want to be looking at Waka Eke Noa. So this is the value proposition, or you like, this is my sales pitch to you in terms of why being outside of the ETS is actually a good thing. So there's 4 things to think about. So choice and control is one of them. So you know, within the Waka Eke Noa options, we're better able to recognise a range of emissions reductions strategies in you as an individual or as a collective. So there's greater control over how the levy rates would be set. You're not subject to a market that's ultimately determined by fossil fuel emitters. So there's some choice and control there, which is good to have. There's the split gas approach. So within the ETS, there is not a split gas approach. So we want to recognise that methane is different. It's a short-lived gas. It's a flow gas. It's not a stock gas. It's emitted. It decays quickly in the atmosphere. So we've taken a split gas approach. So unique price for methane is as compared to those long-lived gases. Carbon sequestration. So think in terms of the Waka Eke Noa options as ETS plus. So while you can get the benefit of sequestration within the ETS, we've created some new categories to do with vegetation, which Ro will talk about shortly, which can be included. They're not included in the ETS. And then agriculture investment, or probably a better term is reinvestment. So the money that is raised through the levy is able to be recycled back into the sector to generate those further emissions reductions. So back to you, Ro.
Great, thanks, Roger. So what I'm just going to do is take you briefly through some of the common features of the alternative options that the partnership has come up with. And there's 3 common elements. There's the split gas approach, sequestration, and a collectives approach that I'm just going to mention. So Roger's kind of already touched on that split gas approach, but this is really fundamental to what we've been trying to achieve as a partnership, is to recognise the split gas approach in the options. And that's because, and the most important element of that in terms of the features of how that split gas is reflected, is also that it recognises and is consistent with the GWP star science, because that science really does sit behind why New Zealand has reduction targets for methane and not targets that go to 0, because the science is really clear that CO2 has to get to 0, net 0, and methane just needs to reduce. And that's why we have a split gas outcome. And so the really fundamental ways in which that's reflected in the 2 options is that there is a unique price for methane. If methane only has to be reduced by a certain amount, it doesn't make sense to link it to the carbon price, because if carbon price, as Roger's indicated, has been rapidly increasing in the last year and a half since the cap's been raised. It's gone from 25 to now sounds like 70, $81 a tonne, and that's projected to keep increasing rapidly. And if we've got a reduction target, it doesn't make sense for us to be maybe tracking towards that target, but the price that we face still going up, because it's linked to what is happening with carbon. The other really important element of that split gas approach for the 2 options is that we've weighed, the 2 options weigh methane, and that's what's priced, the weight of methane, and we're not using carbon dioxide equivalents. We're not using GWP 100 to convert methane into a carbon equivalent. So that's the really big fundamental elements of that split gas approach, and consistency as well with the GWP star science. So the other really key element that's common to the 2 options is that both of them recognise a lot more sequestration or carbon capture on farm than the ETS. So I'm just going to talk through, this slide's just a little bit about the background of some of the principles we used for that, and then the next slide I'll go through what those different categories are. But just straight up, what's not included in the partnership is ETS eligible exotic forestry is not included in the partnership approach. And the reason for that is that there is a lot of exotic forestry has really high carbon sequestration rates and values, and we wanted to avoid double counting on that. And there is quite a lot of exotic forestry on farms that are included in the ETS, and so we wanted to keep that quite separate from the Waka process and avoid that double counting. But there is not very much. There's a huge amount of native forestry on New Zealand farms, but very little of that is currently included in the ETS. Currently, post 1990 native trees are eligible if they meet certain criteria, and very little of that is included in the ETS. So ETS eligible native forestry can be included in the partnership. Now, it was really important for particularly Beef and Lamb, but other organisations as well, and we've worked closely with DairyNZ, really important that if farmers are going to face a price for their emissions, then they need to get proper recognition for the sequestration that's happening on their farms. But in order to get agreement, because this has been a partnership and process with the government, in order to get agreement to go beyond what's currently recognised in the ETS, we needed to follow a few international conventions, and two of them is additionality, and the other one is having a baseline. So I'm just going to explain the rationale for that, and we can get into that in Q&A as well, because I know that's been a big area of conversation with farmers. So in terms of additionality, that's a kind of international principle where you get recognition or payment for something that's giving an additional sequestration rate to what it would have been happening anyway, or BAU. And so new trees is new plantings, that's more than BAU. And if you're doing active management of existing vegetation, existing old native vegetation, you're doing something that adds more sequestration, such as stock exclusion or pest control, that is shown by a lot of studies to add to the sequestration rates, then farmers can get paid for that. So that's the concept of additionality. Now, the other thing that you usually have with a system is you have a baseline for that. And we chose the partnership, after a lot of discussion, chose the 2008 baseline. And that's because there's really good satellite imagery from 2008 onwards. And we're really coming back to the criteria that we were talking about earlier. We wanted to create a system that's simple for farmers to use. And so with a lot of satellite imagery out there, it means that we can have a simpler system, easier burden of proof for farmers to be able to get recognition for their post 2008 trees and their pre 2008 trees, because they can show what was there now and previously. So that's the reason for the 2008 baseline. At the moment, there's no recognition of soil carbon at this stage, but it's something that we're definitely actively looking at. And there was quite a big report that was released on the 31st of January, along with all the consultation documents, that gives a bit of a stock take of where the science is at with soil carbon. There is a really big piece of research getting done in New Zealand at the moment about soil carbon. We know that we've got really high soil carbon stocks in New Zealand, compared to globally, and that's because we're a young country, and also through our style of farming, we've actually been really looking after our soils. A lot of other countries are really interested in getting soil carbon recognised because they've actually depleted their soils quite considerably, whereas we've got really high ones. And so that does make it a bit more complicated for getting recognition for increasing your soil carbon when you've actually already got really, really high ones. But we can obviously dig into that more in the question and answers. So just going on to what those categories are that we've got under Waka Eke Noa. Next slide, please, Rebecca. So these are the, we'd say, ETS plus elements that we've been able to get through this partnership. We have got recognition of pre-2008 native vegetation. Like I said before, the ETS is post, it's only after 1990, we've got all of the, you can get recognition for your pre-1990 native vegetation under this. You just need to meet some criteria in terms of stock exclusion and active management to get that, to show that you're doing something that creates additional sequestration. And then in terms of those other categories that I know are really important to farmers as well, riparian plantings, fruit trees, shelter belts, non-ETS woodlots, and scattered exotics are also ETS additional categories that farmers could get recognition for under Waka Eke Noa. I'll just cover off the last kind of common feature really quickly of the options before we get into them. So the other final one is this concept of ability for collective action under both of the options. And so that means that farmers can form collectives under both the farm level and under the processor hybrid. They can work together to report their emissions or enter into emissions management contracts or sequestration management contracts. So ideas that we've got there of groups that might be interested in that could be farming family operations with multiple farms, but particularly, you know, this was developed as well with feedback from Māori, because often Māori trusts have quite a number of different farms and leases, you know, sometimes up to 50, 60 different properties that they're leasing, and it's just really not practical if they needed to do a separate thing for each one. So that's been a really important thing, you know, reflecting feedback from Māori to come up with options that provide for that. So I'll just pass it over now to Roger.
Right, so we're going to talk about the farm level levy. So this is option 1 in terms of He Waka Eke Noa and the pricing options. Simon mentioned to you before that you can follow along in the booklet. So don't try and draw the wiring diagrams. They're in here, and you should scribble in the booklet. So let's have a look at how this works. So principally, the emissions pricing in this option 1 is based on each farm's unique emissions. So a farmer would calculate their on-farm emissions, that's stock and fertilizer, and it's specific to you. So it's your operation, it's your farming system that you run, the efficiency, the inputs that you use. So that's a key aspect of this option, unique to you. And so that those numbers go into a central calculator. So if we go around the top of the diagram, so that single calculator gives us kind of one source of the truth, if you like, in terms of what your emissions are. And remember that farmers can also use the ETS out to the left in terms of ETS eligible forestry, but they can also enter in sequestration through the vegetation types that Rose just talked about. And so there's an implementation agency or an advisory board, and that board applies a price to those on-farm emissions and for sequestration. And then the revenue is invested into R&D or technology to reduce those emissions. If you reduce your emissions, you pay less, and the money that's recycled goes to reduce emissions on farm. One of the conclusions that we came to, through this process is that if we want to avoid issues like grandparenting or baselines that are just they're simply unacceptable to some of the partners, then we need to come up with a generic approach, and so that approach has to work for everyone. And so the approach that we use here is that everyone pays a little bit of money at a low price, and then the bulk of it is recycled back to drive incentives for sequestration and also incentives for technology uptake. And of course, we have the government out to the side, and we have research institutes out to the right-hand side as well. If we go to the next slide, thanks, Becky. So as Roe outlined, the split gas pricing, so A plus B minus C equals the net cost. Easy to remember. So A is the weight of methane times a unique price. Notice there it's the weight of methane. So we talked a little bit before about GWP 100, not for methane in He Waka Eke Noa. It's the weight of the methane times the unique price. And then B is the weight of the long-lived gases, and there we use GWP 100 because that's the appropriate metric to use for long-lived gases times the unique price. And then we have C, the amount of eligible on-farm sequestration times a unique price. So A plus B minus C equals the net cost. So let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Becky. And then quite a bit of interest in terms of rebates or that recycling. So let's just talk a little bit about that. So there would be incentives in this option at the farm level, and they would be for existing or increased sequestration and or incentives to use the technology to reduce emissions. And so think of He Waka Eke Noa as kind of like a super collective. So everybody chips in And for those, you know, where technology, for those for whom technology becomes available, and it could be like, for example, an inhibitor, or it could be genetics. So those parts of the sector that can take up that technology, that can be enabled by everyone. So everybody benefits from it, if you like. And then in terms of the incentives, this could happen through the rebate being a multiplier of the initial levy charge to incentivize those further emissions reductions. And what I mean by multiplier, so the price that you get for reducing methane might be, for example, 2.5 to 5 times greater than the price you're actually paying for the emissions in the first place. So we actually need to incentivize people to actually make the emissions reductions. So summary in terms of the farm level option, every farm is treated uniquely. You get charged for your emissions, you get credit for the sequestration, and then there are incentives to drive that change. So farmers would face a lower price and cost if the emissions are reduced in the farm level system.
So yeah, I'm going to take us through how the processor level hybrid levy, it's a mouthful, works. So next slide, please, Rebecca. So this one here, again, outlines, and I'll talk it through from a farmer perspective, how this would look for you. So like the ETS, to some extent, you are paying to the processor. A farmer would send their animals away, to the processor. The processor would calculate the cost of those emissions based on a national average emissions factor times by the price of those emissions. Different to the ETS in that there would be a unique price for methane. So that's the difference between how this one would operate at that level. And you'd have a different price as well for, you'd have your price for nitrous oxide. So the farmer faces that cost, and it's based on national average emissions factors per kilo. I'll dig into that a little bit more in a minute. And then the processors pay that money to the implementing agency, and that money's held there. Now, a farmer could pay the price, and that's it, done. Or if they are wanting to reduce their emissions, or have got sequestration on their farm, they could decide it's worth the effort. I'm going to enter into an emissions management contract or a sequestration management contract, and I'm going to be able to get some of that money back that I've just paid to the processor, and they get that from the implementing agency. The implementing agency can also use that money that's come through from the processors for reinvesting into technologies and research into technologies that reduce emissions as well. So that's how that option works. Then the next slide, please, Rebecca, just in terms of breaking it down in terms of the A plus B minus C, how it works is you've got your A, which is your emissions factors, your national average factors, times by the unique price for methane and the amount that you're producing of methane, the weight, plus your emissions, national inventory emissions factors for nitrous oxide times by the price and the weight that you're producing in GWP 100 equivalents, minus, if you want to go to the effort, minus the EMC and the SMC money that you've got back, and that's the net amount that you would be kind of facing. In terms of how those emissions management contracts and sequestration management contracts work, we're working through that at the moment. In terms of the emissions management contract, the idea is it could be based on a baseline and showing that you've reduced your emissions from a baseline, or you could be paid per action. Say, for example, you introduce low methane sheep, and you could get a certain amount back for doing that. So there's two sort of options that we're considering for how that could be kind of done, and how you could get money back depending on what route we take. And then the way that it, you could get paybacks for is management changes that reduce your emissions on farms, use of technology to reduce emissions on farm, potentially early action that has reduced emissions. The sequestration management contract would be for those putting in that you are committing to, you've got certain amounts of vegetation and you're committing to continue to protect those types of vegetation. At the moment, the length of time that we're looking for those contracts is about a minimum of 3 to 5 years. That's something we're keen to get feedback on. Obviously, for the sequestration management contract, that's a much longer term thing. And we are looking at ways in which you might need to make a change to your land title, potentially to note that that's something that you've entered into a sequestration management contract, kind of like you would do a covenant if you've entered into a QE2 trust to protect your native vegetation.
We've done some high level analysis of the impacts and costs. So I'm just going to talk you through that now, because most farmers that I talk to, the first question is, how much is this going to cost me? So here's some information to think about. Firstly, I wanted to talk about emissions reduction. So we talked a little bit before about when we hand this over to the government, will the government accept it? This is one thing that the government's going to be looking at. So you know, the scheme has to be credible in terms of delivering on emissions reduction. So we've modelled this. So I'll just talk you through this now, because it's really important that you understand where we get the reductions from. So if you see the column that's headed up existing policies, so you know, pricing doesn't have to do all the heavy lifting. So there's acknowledgement that current policy is also having an impact on emissions. So things like the NPS for fresh water, there's been some land use change, and there's been some de-intensification, and we just talked about some forestry impacts, right, in terms of that land use change. So in both the farm level levy and the processor level hybrid, you'll see in that existing policies column, there's already for methane in particular a 4.5% reduction. So remember that the target is 10, and you get 4.5% just from business as usual, you know, dynamics, economics, and government policy. And then if you jump along the column to the waste sector has biogenic methane as well, and they are responsible for reducing their emissions. And by 2030, you know, we reckon we can get another 1.7%. So thank you, waste sector. And then we come to the levy and the revenue recycling. So putting a price on something doesn't reduce emissions necessarily. And you'll see down below that we've got the NZ ETS is only estimated to reduce emissions by 1% by 2030. The key point there is that we're assuming that money is never recycled back to do anything with. But we've done you know, modelling through here, Waka Eke Noa, to look at what could we do in terms of reinvesting that revenue, in terms of incentivising either behaviour change, technology uptake, etc. And that column adds the further percentage in. So for farm level levy, for methane, the revenue recycling gets an additional 4.3%. So when you look at the totality of where we get to in terms of the methane reductions in the total column, it's approximating to where the legislated target is. You may not accept the legislated target, but just wanted to make the key point that the price alone does not have to do all the heavy lifting. So the emissions reductions can come from existing policy. We should definitely count that. We should definitely include what the waste sector is doing, and we can actually use the revenue to the benefit of the sector itself to reinvest. Next slide, thanks. So the modelled impacts and costs. I know you'll kind of like, you'll dive down into those numbers and you'll try and work out what it means for you on your particular farm. But I just wanted to talk conceptually for a second, because we're after price discovery here, right? So there's a couple of things that we want to kind of discover. So one is the price of change, if you like. So what are we going to have to pay farmers to use technology or incentivize management change? So there's that kind of aspect. And the second aspect is, what does that mean for what everybody has to pay, you know, to achieve that marginal difference that I talked about before to get to close to the 10%? So there's a couple of areas where we're looking at price discovery. So in terms of the modelling, you'll see from 2025 to 2030, the costs in both of the Waka Eke Noa options are very similar to the ETS. But of course, that depends on the value of sequestration, so what we pay for sequestration, and also the cost of incentivising the mitigation technology. So remember, the money is apportioned across the things that we want to do within Waka Eke Noa, across the sequestration and across, you know, R&D spend or incentivising change, that multiplier that I talked about before. And then post 2030, if you're comparing the two options to the NZ ETS price, it's less than the ETS. And there's a couple of things that happen in the ETS. One we talked about before was that escalating price, right? So if you're driving to net zero and you're constraining the carbon budgets, the price goes north, and it goes north very, very quickly. And the other thing too is within the ETS, there's free allocation. So the free allocation is for trade exposed or emissions intensive industries, and that free allocation phases down. So you've got the price heading north and you've got free allocation heading south, and that means that the price really matters in the ETS, not so much in the He Waka Eke Noa options, because we're not in the ETS. Yeah, so just to recap, so 2025 to 2030, costs are very similar to the ETS, but beyond 2030, the prices start to diverge because we're looking to manage methane to reduce and stabilize at the right level. So what are the long-term model impacts and costs? And a farmer said the other night, farmers are going to pay for this anyway, and that's a fair call, right? So from the modelling that we've done, it's evident that this is going to cost. So not trying to hide anything here. It is going to cost money to deliver on what we need to do in terms of emissions reduction. So we can expect that we have to pay for it. So in terms of the modelling that we've done, it kind of suggests in terms of the impacts on the average farm profit, it's going to be between 4 and 6% in 2030. So that's the kind of impact on profitability, and you can see across the various sectors how that kind of impacts. But the extent to which it impacts depends on a couple of things, right? So it depends on the extent to which production also decreases, and it also depends a lot on how farmers change their systems and how those technologies come through. So, in summary, we've built a couple of options or a program that's going to be effective in terms of hitting targets. It is going to come at some cost, and what we're seeking to do in giving farmers, flexibility is to get those targets met across the whole of the sector and at the lowest cost to all of us.
So I'm just going to quickly take us through how the options compare. In terms of how they compare, the He Waka Eke Noa options are more costly to set up than the ETS. But as the ETS, and I want to emphasize currently, as the ETS is currently written in legislation, it doesn't recognise on-farm emissions reductions. It doesn't recognise on-farm mitigations or current sequestration. It doesn't recognise methane differently, and it doesn't currently reinvest revenue back into agriculture. So that's why it's kind of cheaper to administer. If they looked at some of the recycling and sequestration, then obviously the cost of the ETS backstop would go up. But one thing that the government has made really clear in the conversations that we've had with them is they can't do a split gas price for methane. And, if farmers are doing all the right things and using some of these technologies to reduce our emissions, we're actually making progress towards our target, then the price of methane should reflect that progress and stay quite stable or flat, as opposed to kind of going up because the carbon price is going up. And so that's why we think that the ETS backstop has a greater impact in the long-term profitability than the He Waka Eke Noa options. This is just a diagram showing how those options kind of work, stacking them up against each other. The ETS may have administration simplicity and possibly less complex for farmers if they're just paying a price, but it doesn't fit with the criteria that we outlined at the start that we used to go through the options. And then in terms of the He Waka Eke Noa options, the farm level levy is probably going to be more costly and complex to set up because we really have to develop that calculator and the granularity of that calculator in terms of being able to measure and scientifically kind of understand how your emissions might reduce by doing certain things is going to take some time. So it's probably going to be more costly. But then the processor level hybrid, it's probably less costly and complex, but obviously if you went into an EMC or an SMC, then it probably could be quite complex for some farmers, depending on how level that you want to go to. But in terms of the criteria that we used to assess the options, they stack up pretty well in terms of fit for purpose and science and carbon offsetting, profitability and reinvestment and split gas approach. So another option, as a result of some of the pre-Christmas targeted engagement we did, another option that we were keen to get farmer feedback on is the idea or the potential for starting off with the processor level hybrid system and transitioning to a farm level system over time. And that's the reason that we've kind of come up with that option, is that farmers, we've had quite strong feedback, and we had that tonight as well. I think that farmers instinctively like the farm level approach, because I think you have more control about what it is that you're doing and measuring what you're doing and being able to see the, that reflected in what you pay, and that really incentivizes, change. But I think some of the other comments that we've had have reflected some of the feedback we've got, is that people are concerned about how long it might take to develop a proper and effective calculator. And we really want to make sure that we kind of get that right. And so some feedback we've had from farmers is, I want to kind of see how that farm calculator goes before I kind of embark on all that work. How are you going to get 25,000 farmers up and running with a farm level calculator and farm level system from the start of 2025? Is it worth doing it at the moment, that farm level, if there's not that many technologies available at the moment? But we do believe that a lot of those, we've got low methane sheep, and I think the expectation is that some of those technologies will become more available from the early 2030s onwards. And so that really makes that farm level approach much more worthwhile to invest that time in. And then also there's concerns around having all the people ready to support you with doing these things in place from 2025. Like we've had concerns about the freshwater farm plans. So for that reason, we've developed this potential option of starting off with the processor level hybrid. Still allows farmers that are early adopters already doing stuff, already want to do stuff, to do the EMC and SMC. And if we did go down this track, then we would make sure that those two things, the SMC and the EMC, worked within a farm level system and could transition quickly to that farm level system.
What I do want to say is, Roger premised this when he opened. He said, hey, look, this is kind of important. Hey, look, this is kind of important for our farming community. So I want to thank you guys for coming on and taking the time to go through this. We've cut into your evening, it's 2 hours. But seriously, this we've got to get this right. And I'm slightly concerned that a bunch of our farming community think this might just go away. So I really want to thank you guys for coming on, listening and actively participating in this. You'll be well aware of the Omicron impact, and so we had to sort of put the meetings off for a week. We kicked the meetings off on Tuesday. We're now at Thursday. We've reached 800 farmers this week, and between the DairyNZ and the shared beef and lamb roadshows and webinars. So it's been great. Really want to call out, it's really good working alongside the two teams like this, working in unison. We've been on the road with the DairyNZ team. I've been down south, and it's just been fantastic. So I just want to sort of thank, all the participants, all the presenters on the screen, but especially I want to thank the teams for working so well together. Look, it's really important, when we had this Omicron outbreak and we didn't know if we could have these meetings, either physical or what we were going to do, we went back to government and says, we are not going to bring you a recommendation without consulting with our farmers, because that's the respectful way to do that, and that's the respectful way to get the absolute and honest feedback. So between the mix of the webinars and the tightly controlled meetings we're having, we actually really want to get this feedback so we can make the best system. We are collating all the feedback. Tonight will feel like a bit of a brain dump for you guys, because we've really just brain dumped on you for 2 hours, and we've asked you to give a response to some questions. That's not your final ability to respond to what you've heard. Could you go home and sort of mull on this, drive the tractor, go crutch some ewes, milk some cows, think about it while you're doing that stuff? You know how like us farmers do, and think about it, and then actually give us the feedback, which we can do that online. When we get that feedback, all of the partner groups are bringing this back to the Waka Eke Noa Partnership Group, and we'll be collating all that data, and we will be coming up with a preferred alternative proposal back to the government by the 31st of May. You'll be well aware we got that 1 month extension. So that gives us slightly more time to meet and get robust feedback, but slightly more time to collate the information. We will feed the information back to our farming community and then give it to government 31st of May. In parallel, the Climate Change Commission will be developing their advice on the pricing option. Got a great question tonight, and I got this one we referred to. How can we make sure that government takes this seriously? We as a collective want to come with a really strong voice around what we think will deliver emissions reductions and will actually make our industry profitable and have a future, but as I say, deliver on the aspirations that are important to New Zealand and our customers. So the government will then base a decision on the Haywaka feedback and the Climate Change Commission, what they recommend, and then they take it out to the New Zealand public. So as I say, if we get all our farmers on board and all our, it's really easy to talk to our neighbours, talk to our urban cousins if we're all quite clear what success looks like. If we're all slightly tripping over stuff and a wee bit confused, it's just going to make it slightly harder for the government to know what we actually think. One thing we didn't touch tonight is let's not be scared of this stuff. Jacqueline talked about the other advocacy stuff that we're doing in the space. There is a serious amount of research going on in this space now, like the Ravens have down clean pond technology, which will give you a 5% reduction on your dairy herds. We've got the DSM, the 3NOPs. It's an inhibitor that you can use in your dairy shed. We did the work at PGGRC, feed it in shed morning and in shed at night. It'll give you a 6% knockdown. If you put those two technologies together, there's a 11% reduction when we've got a 10% target reduction by 2030. Go to the sheep industry. We've got the genetics being released through beef and lamb genetics. I personally went out and bought my first cut of low methane rams the other day. If I select on methane traits alone, I will get my 10% reduction by 2030. If I go across incorporating other breed values, depending on where we put the criteria on the methane reductions, you can still get 3 to 5%. We looked at that graph around the other policies that are going to deliver that 4 point whatever and 1.7 out of waste methane. Let's not be scared of this. Let's crack on and do this and be the first sector to actually deliver on this and stand proud. So thank you, guys. Please give us your feedback and just thank you for coming on, and thanks to the team for giving their time this evening.